Welcome to the Black Magic Woman podcast with Mundanara Bales.
It's about us as Aboriginal people, regardless of title.
You know, relationalism, not war making, is the best way to have security.
Now is the best time to be a black fellow, especially in business.
It's so powerful to see successful Aboriginal women.
I am a survivor of the stolen generations.
I'd like to begin this podcast by following proper protocol and acknowledge the Cubby Cubby and Gubby Gubby peoples here on the Sunshine Coast. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We as First Nations peoples have never ceded our sovereignty in this country, now known as Australia. The Acknowledgement of Country is an ancient diplomatic protocol, a tradition that goes back tens of thousands of years in this country. So it's got nothing to do with reconciliation when you're acknowledging country, and it's got nothing to do with being politically correct either when you think about how long our people have lived in this country. So for all Australians, see the Acknowledgement of Country as an invitation for you to participate in the oldest living continuous culture in world history. I love starting off with the acknowledgement like I always do, but I always see the acknowledgement as an opportunity to educate the audience, my audience, people that are listening to this podcast. You may have done an acknowledgement in your organisation, or you may have thought that the acknowledgement was not for you. The welcome to country is quite different. Only a traditional owner can welcome you to country. So here I am on the beautiful lands of the Cubby Cubby Gubby Gubby peoples, and I'm back in Coolum, and I have been away for 20 days, so it's actually been quite refreshing. I've been on a holiday with 5 kids, so now I need a holiday from the holiday. So I'm actually really excited to be here today to actually have a yarn with a sister that I've always admired and looked up to, and I guess it's taken me back to an introduction in the boardroom at 98.9 FM, aka Brisbane Indigenous Media Association in West End in Brisbane. And my dad, who passed 6 years ago, Tiger Bales, introduced me to you, Tanya, and it's been one introduction and that's it. So I'm actually really pleased that I get to have this yarn with you today. So Tanya Hosch, welcome to the Black Magic Woman podcast.
Thank you very much. It's very cool to be invited on to your program.
Well, thank you so much for I know how busy you are, for taking out an hour out of your busy calendar. So thank you. And you have been on my hit list for about 12 months, just so you know. There is a hit list. There's a guest list where you kind of go, one day, hopefully I get them on the podcast. And there is a long list of others that I'm trying to, I want more people to hear about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's stories, our journeys, our successes, our challenges, whether we're in business or working in organisations and doing really good things, but also for non-Indigenous people. I've had a lot of amazing other people that don't identify as First Nations on this podcast as well. And I think that, you know, media runs in my blood, radio runs in my blood. And my dad had a talk show called Let's Talk with Tiger Bales. That's still going on 98.9 FM. So it's a big shout out to all of the Aboriginal community radio stations right across the country that hopefully, if not playing the podcast now, but hopefully later on will see Black Magic Woman as content for their programs. So I'm going to hand over to you, Tanya, to do what I would say you would do better than I would at introducing yourself. So tell us who you are and who your mob and where you grew up.
Yeah, sure. So starting right at the beginning, I was conceived on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne and born in Adelaide on Kaurna country. My natural mother because I was adopted. So my natural mother was from Wales. She came out to Australia as an 8-year-old girl on a boat with her family, and their first stop was Fremantle in Western Australia. And she met, obviously, my father, who I don't know by name. He's a Torres Strait Islander man, I know that much. And they conceived me in Melbourne. My natural mother was 24 when she had me, and her family didn't know that she was with a black man. So she moved to South Australia to complete the pregnancy without the knowledge of the rest of her family, gave birth to me in 1970, and decided after 3 weeks that she would release me into adoption. In fact, when I finally got some of my adoption records, in some of the paperwork that she filled out, she actually wrote that if I'd not been born quite so dark, she might have kept me. I was adopted when I was 3 weeks old, the lottery that it was, into a fabulous family with a white mother, and as it turned out, an Aboriginal father who's a Darug man from New South Wales. And I spent my childhood and most of my life, and still do, live in South Australia. My dad being from country New South Wales up past the Blue Mountains, all the black fellas in the family were over there. There were a lot of car trips over the Hay Plains, driving between Adelaide and New South Wales to visit my dad's family. So growing up, I realised I was different from the perspective that I'd be at places with my mum and people wouldn't always see us as together. So even as a young child, having shop assistants act as though I was some stranded child on my own, not recognising that I was standing with my mum. And I remember being young and being really confused that they didn't understand that she was my mum. Mm-hmm. That's sort of my story in a nutshell. And I think, working out my identity was hard. It's still challenging in many respects, but, I have been able to visit the Torres Strait. I haven't been able to find my natural family as yet. I've definitely had a really long journey with the link-up services, and actually some of the information I just shared, I only know because of what I've been able to uncover through that process.
Wow, I was not expecting that, Tanya, at all. I honestly, I love the fact that what I hear on the podcast is a first time for me, and therefore a first time for listeners if they don't already know your story. But you can't Google this, right? You probably have never spoken about this publicly, that someone could just Google and then go, here's your whole life story. So thank you so much for sharing, the start of your life and how, especially today, that you're still on a journey of still. Are you still trying to find your family, or a link up still trying to find the Torres Strait Islander family of yours?
Yeah, so not especially through link up. Link up did actually help me find my natural mother, because when I was born, children were still being forcibly removed in 1970. And it was common practice to remove the identifying information of the Indigenous parent from the records. And so the microfiche, which you're probably too young to even know what they are, but they were these little plastic slides that used to contain information. You'd sort of have to, sorry about my dog barking in the background.
That's all right.
And you'd have to look at them through sort of like I don't even know the word. You'd have to look at them through a special machine to be able to see all the text. And so all the information about my natural father's sort of wiped out off the microfiche, which is like permanent, like there's no way to recover that information. And so one of the things I learnt through the adoption records was that my natural mother was in a relationship with my father for 4 years. She wrote to him after I was born, so he knows I exist. So I know that much, but his name. So I have sort of through Link Up reached out to her, appealed to her to let me know what his name is and things like that, but she's not willing to engage at all, which is...
So your biological mother is still alive?
As far as I know, yep.
But you've never met her?
No, and she won't engage. My Link Up worker has spoken to her, but she won't.
Oh, my goodness.
She won't engage with me. I've written to her and things like that, but to no avail, unfortunately.
Well, I was going to say Ancestry.com has kind of, in terms of our family, so my dad comes from the Watsons, right? So the Watsons, my grandmother was Maureen Watson. You may have met my Granny Mook back in the day. So Granny Mook is the eldest of, I think, 7 children. Their father, which is my great-grandfather, Sam Watson, and there's 5 Sam Watsons. So this is the first Sam Watson, who was a Nebo man, taken away from Nebo at a very young age. The rest of the Watsons, like his cousins and that, were actually sent to Cherbourg. So our great-grandfather grew up on a property owned by the manager and treated really badly. Cut a long story short, he had an affair or something. Well, he basically did have an affair, and just recently, one of my grandmother's brothers, who passed recently, done a DNA sample with Ancestry.com. And another family in Rockhampton, the Torres, they also had done this DNA, right? So on this Ancestry.com, it's linked up the Watsons with this Aboriginal family that are also Torres Strait Islander.
Right.
In Rocky.
Yeah, wow.
So we've had this family reunion this year to meet the descendants of our great-grandfather. And it was a big shock to, say, my Aunt Lilla and Uncle Charlie and my grandmother's brothers and sisters that are still alive, because obviously their dad worked away a lot. And this other child was made, and, all these years later, like Auntie Lilla's 84 years old and just found out that her father has had another family that nobody has known about. So I've just done my DNA.
Yeah.
And I actually want to find my mother's side, which is the O'Reillys. They're Irish. So my nan had 2 children to Francis O'Reilly, and he left one day and never came home from work. So my mum was born Catherine Maria O'Reilly, red hair and freckles, and had 7 children. And when you spoke about this kind of feeling that was confusing where people didn't know that you belonged to your mum, I had the same experience. So we would be with our mum. So I'm kind of, I don't say I'm black. I've got brown skin, My mum, red hair, freckles, and fiery Irish woman, Aboriginal woman, grew up on the block in Redfern. And out of 7 of us, the last one turned out with blonde hair, blue eyes, and white skin.
Yeah.
So that little blonde hair, blue eyed, fair skinned girl, we don't say white skin, we say fair skin or light skin. My little sister Jida looks nothing like her other siblings, nothing like us. Yeah. So then people in Redfern were, kind of not really accusing my mum, but were thinking that my dad, Tiger, was not the father of Jida. But little did people know that my dad's grandmother was a little Aboriginal Scottish woman with a Scottish father who also had very fair skin, blonde hair, blue eyes. Yeah. And when she moved to Brisbane in the 60s, she used to introduce herself to people as, in the bank to the manager. She would say, "Mister, I'm a black woman and all of my children are black." Yeah. So she was white as a ghost. Yeah. My grandmother, Maureen, was very dark. Auntie Lilla's quite fair, and then you've got Uncle Ross Watson, Uncle Lenny and Uncle Charlie are all very fair-skinned.
Yeah.
And that's how she got around in Brisbane, in the 60s and 70s. So we come in all shapes, colours and sizes, and I think it's really important for listeners to understand that I hate when people ask me to justify my identity.
Yeah.
They ask me to justify my cultural identity because I don't look like my ancestors, right?
Yeah.
And I feel that that's probably one thing every day as a lighter-skinned black fella, because I'm not as dark as a lot of my family members. I feel that that's a part of like the education of mainstream Australians, that people need to understand that our skin colour doesn't define us. And when we say that we're black fellas, it's got nothing to do with skin colour.
Yeah.
And
correct.
having to justify our identity every single day, especially in the workplace, can make that, workplace feel culturally unsafe for us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Yeah, I definitely can relate to some of that. And I think, one of the most difficult things about that is the questioning of whether a certain action or behaviour is considered racist, because I think there's still a lot of people out there that think fairer skinned that you don't experience racism either.
Exactly.
Which is a real issue, I think, in a lot of organisations and in society generally.
100% agree. And I would say that a lot of us, in terms of, First Nations peoples, Indigenous peoples, black fellas, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, when you kind of grow up in I'm Aboriginal, so I'm going to say when you grow up in your Aboriginal household, I call it the Aboriginal world. You grow up in that world, you're socialised amongst Aboriginal people and family and community, and then you go to school, and that's the Western world or white fella world, and it's very different to the Aboriginal world. And to be able to navigate those two worlds every single day is quite exhausting. Even today, like I'm 38 and still find that, I'm navigating two worlds. And I don't think it will ever change. I don't think it will in my lifetime. But the work that I do at Black Card is about basically how do we push these two worlds closer together so they're overlapping. So we've got more non-Indigenous Australians walking in our world and vice versa, because for the last 230 years plus, we've been walking in the Western world, but not a lot of Australians have walked in our world. And I think the beauty of the podcast is inviting people over into our world to get an insight into, our experiences, our stories, and hopefully not just being inspired by it, but then learning, hearing this conversation today, people will think twice now about, we've got a new Indigenous trainee in the organisation that does not look Indigenous in their eyes, but they will think twice now about going, are you a half? Are you part? Or are you a quarter? So you're not full Aboriginal. So those comments are quite offensive and highly, I would say, inappropriate and disrespectful. So I see this opportunity as having these conversations to educate wider Australians about the First Nations peoples, but also about, the tens of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge that comes directly from this land. How can we share our culture with all Australians so that they can celebrate our culture, not just at NAIDOC Week or National Reconciliation Week, but celebrate it at every opportunity and hopefully every single day. But they see it as a positive and not as a negative, especially when they're engaging and interacting with us as Indigenous people. So that's leading me to what you do, Tanya, at the AFL. And I would love to hear more about how did you even get into the role that you're into now? Because I never come across another Indigenous person that's kind of at that kind of very senior leadership position in the AFL. So how did that come about?
How did it come about? Well, look, so I was working on the Recognise awareness raising campaign for constitutional change before I was at the AFL. And in that role, you know, I think that's why I was meeting with your dad that day, actually, to talk to him about that. I'd known him for a number of years, and, you know, he'd been very generous in coming and speaking at different youth leadership events that I used to be involved in, organising and things like that. And I'd always admired him a great deal. And so his point of view was something that I wanted to listen to. And I was very aware of the sort of, you know, the conversations about constitutional recognition and whether it was good or not, and, you know, that compared to treaty and sovereignty and all of those sorts of things. And so the conversations I used to have with your dad were really, really instructive and helpful, and he was always incredibly respectful and open with me, which I'm really grateful for. He gave me some really important guidance. But in the process of doing that work, and I had been in that work for just over 4 years, there was no political end in sight in terms of seeing a referendum called. There was no clarity on a model for change, and it had been a really, really hard slog. I worked with amazing people, and, you know, there was amazing Australians from right around the country that were supporting the work. And so it was a great experience from a campaign perspective. I was very, very fortunate. One of the things that we did in that work was have partnerships with sporting organisations. So we had a partnership with the NRL, cricket and the AFL. Now, when we had our first partnership with the AFL during their Indigenous round, the sort of visibility of the campaign really increased, and I think we signed up something like 27,500 Australians to support the campaign over 5 days, which was a lot in campaign terms, and that told me a lot. And we'd also get, you know, sizable bumps of support after working with the NRL and cricket as well. But it made me think about the power of sport as a platform to reach people who are not reading the front end of the paper. They're only reading the back end. And it sort of made me think. And then when I started to feel that I couldn't continue in the recognised job, it was taking its toll on my mental health pretty significantly. It was a very taxing role. I ended up realising that I probably couldn't keep going. I didn't want to do any harm to the campaign, but I knew I couldn't continue. And it just so happens that Gil McLachlan, the CEO, had reached out to me on advice from Paul Briggs, Yorta Yorta man from Shepparton in Victoria, who'd been a mentor and is still a mentor to me today. And Paul had suggested that Gil should have a chat to me about a role that was coming up at the AFL. Now we did, and it was a sort of overseeing diversity programs role, and it wasn't something that I was interested in, so I was very clear about that. But what I didn't realise was that, you know, Gil and I had quite a long conversation. I wasn't even aware that they had AFLW coming around the corner, and in the conversations I was having with Gil, you know, I shared that I'd had a background in working in women's services and then later in women's policy in my sort of mid to late 20s. And that was an area, gender was an area that I had already sort of felt that I'd quite like to go back to at some point. And so Gil started to think that I might be able to play a broader role at the organisation. And so we had a number of conversations over 3.5 months, and they ended up not appointing anybody into the role looking after the programs, but they appointed me to the executive. And so when that happened in August 2016, it made me the second woman and the first Indigenous person ever appointed to the AFL executive.
Wow. What a huge achievement for you, but also for them as a sporting organisation to finally have another female voice at the table, but also an Indigenous female voice at the table. And that's 2016, and you're still there 5 years later. Yeah, 5 seasons later, I'm still there. I consider my role of that of a sort of professional disruptor. I'm there to, to shake up the status quo and, to help increasingly make the game more available for everyone. Obviously, one of the great things in the role with Recognise is I did get to work with a lot of, sporting leaders. And so Adam Goods and Mark O'Loughlin had been ambassadors for the Recognise campaign, and so I had worked quite closely with both of them in that work. And obviously after the way that Adam left the game, I definitely consulted him and Mick about whether I should go into the AFL or not. And they definitely had some misgivings about that. But for me, I felt that it was such a good opportunity. I knew I couldn't continue in the role that I was in, and I thought that leaving the role I was in to go to the AFL was also going to be one that left a least amount of risk to the campaign as a result of my departure. And, at the time that I did move on, it was an incredibly hard decision. And, in fact, I sat on that decision for over a month before I gave a final answer. And, I think not because I was confident, but I guess I had nothing to lose. And so I just kept, trying to get the best possible outcome for myself going into this role. And as a result of that, I was very clear that if I wasn't on the executive, then it probably wasn't worth me doing. And even though it was a big thing at the time, and I naively had no idea what a big deal it was, not having ever worked in sport before, but then I got there and discovered it was a really big deal. And but if I hadn't really, pushed for that seniority, I don't think that would have happened. And, I'm pretty sure that I wouldn't still be there. So your portfolio at the AFL, now for people that don't know, the AFL, if you're not into AFL, because we've got listeners all around the world, AFL is the Australian Football League.
Yes.
And I would say that has a high percentage of Indigenous players playing in the AFL? Yeah.
I mean, if you think about the men's game, it's usually around 10% of all the players in the men's game, and at the moment, for the women's game, it's about 5%.
Uh-huh. So your portfolio includes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues, gender equality, sexuality, gender diversity, racism and sexism.
Yep.
And so you're tasked with the implementation of the AFL's enhanced Indigenous strategy. So you're also advising the AFL Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Council and the maintenance of the Respect and Responsibility Policy 2017. And I think that's really important that I highlight that right now in this conversation because at the Black Card, we deliver a 3-hour, mainly on Zoom now. I wouldn't call it anti-racism training, but a lot of people do see cultural competence or cultural capability training as anti-racism training. There are aspects that we are trying to kind of, tackle racism and systemic racism in particular. But at Black Card, we're actually educating people about Aboriginal terms of reference. So we're educating people about our governance structure. We're educating people about identity, country, community, elders, logic, all based on our knowledge, right? Not interpretations of what it is. So at Black Card, we've got a few different facilitators. We've got Aboriginal facilitators, Torres Strait Islander facilitator, Henry Nona, which is deadly. But we've also got Daryl White as one of our Black Card apprentices. And Daryl played for the Brisbane Lions or Brisbane Bears back in the day. Most people that have done Black Card training, especially at ANZ Bank, because a lot of the ANZ Bank staff members are Victorian based, and that's where I would say that a lot of AFL supporters are in Victoria. That's according to just delivering Black Card training, right? So I wouldn't know outside of engaging with participants through delivering training. So when people see Daryl on the screen, it's like, oh my God, there's this banter that happens in the chat about whatever game it was. I'm an NRL fan, South Sydney Rabbitohs all the way, right? So they see Daryl White, and all of a sudden you can see that you've got a lot of AFL supporters. And he played, I think he retired about 15 years ago. But we actually play this video. It's a 2-minute response that SBS and ITV produced around racism in AFL. And Daryl actually speaks to that video. So it's him in the video. And then he actually talks about, at Black Card, what we focus on is our strengths, not our weaknesses. It's a strength-based approach in everything that we do. So what he talks about is what the AFL have been, trying to do. And he actually mentions the policy around respect and responsibility in 2017, which is really good because there's a lot of negative press around the AFL when there is racism, but there's not much positive stuff. So he actually then balances it up with, okay, this has happened and it's happening a lot. Some's reported and some's not reported. But he actually then talks about what AFL has done since, I guess, Nicky Winmar, Adam Goodes, and even the few most recent things that have happened in the media. For Daryl, though, to talk about it, I think it's really good because he's actually lived it himself as an ex-AFL player. And he's still involved, I think, to some degree in going out and talking to different at different events and schools and whatever. But I just want to say really quickly that there's racism across all sectors of society. It's not just in sport. It's in all sectors of society. And the Australian Dream documentary with Adam Goodes and Stan Grant, there's a speech that we play. It's an anti-racism speech that we play at Black Card, and we call it the Australian Dream speech.
Yep.
And it blows people away that this has happened in this country, and it's happened to someone like Adam Goodes.
Yeah.
Goodsy was Australian of the Year, and you recently, 2021, South Australian of the Year, so congratulations.
Thank you.
You've got a platform, Tanya, not just now at AFL, but, you're, I would say, a high-profile person. I know who you are, and I think a lot of people know who you are. Do you feel this extra pressure, not just as, like I said, you're a First Nations woman and you also work at the AFL in a very senior role, but in the blackfellow world, like in our society, right, in our community, do you feel this extra sense of pressure or responsibility to create change in your role at the AFL? Do you feel that there's this extra kind of pressure or responsibility?
Yeah, I do, absolutely. And I think anyone in my situation would, and I think, other blackfellas who work at the AFL feel the same. Even if they're in a different part of the business, they feel the same sort of pressure. I think, even though I'm talking to things that aren't just Indigenous, one of the things that you become very cognizant of is that every time you do advocate or speak into a situation, there's another layer of judgment or, another layer of critique that's there in terms of whether you're representing the issues well. Now, sometimes that can mean that you're representing the issues in a way that is really going to discomfort people, and they're not always going to appreciate and enjoy that. And then there's other times where you've got to decide to play the long game to keep people engaged in what's required. One of the things that I've realised is that in the 5 years, there's an enormous amount of goodwill, and it's been said so many times, where would the game be without Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander players, because they're some of the best players to have ever played our code. And so, how do we then translate that playing excellence into other elements of black excellence into this sector that is big, is worth a lot of money to the country.
Yeah.
1 in every 24 Australians is a paid member of an AFL club, which is significant. And even in COVID, we maintained a huge number of members, even though they couldn't even use their memberships to go to games.
Now that's commitment.
It is.
Yeah. Passion, commitment, dedication, love for the game. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, the big issues that we've seen play out on field, I think, are a representation of what happens every day. And I'm often doing media interviews about racism in our game, and I always try to end the conversation by saying, but let's not forget that every high-profile incident we know about, there's probably hundreds happening every day that people are looking the other way at. They're not addressing it, and they're happening to people without a voice, without support, without anywhere to go, without any confidence that if they did complain that there would be anyone who even cared or paid attention, and those people are being harmed as well. So I always like to sort of bring it back, because you're absolutely right. Racism doesn't just occur in sport, but sport is such a huge part of who we are. It's a social activity. It's quite tribal in many respects. I mean, even listening to you talk about South Sydney, you were so staunch. They're my people. Sport's important. It's an amazing platform to reach a lot of people at once. But the example that we set in sport is really critical to, sending a message about what we expect. And, so that's where the pressure comes, because if I can't help create the right response to all of these different areas of discrimination that can occur, with the platform that we have, it's a huge privilege, and with that comes responsibility to set the right example. And yes, we don't always get it right, and there's a lot of politics in sport as well. But I can see progress that we're making in the code, and it's important for me as well to recognise that any success I'm seen to have is only because other people are supporting that to happen, because I don't have an operational job. There's nothing about my job that makes football happen on the weekend. But, making sure that we've got an Aboriginal person on the AFL tribunal for the first time, in 2019, that could only happen because Steve Hocking, who was the head of football operations, and our general counsel, Andrew Dillon, supported me in making sure that we had a black fella there.
And that's what I absolutely love about black fellas being, having a seat at the table. Like, if you can't, my mum used to say this, I didn't know what she was talking about, right? If you can't beat them, join them. But now I know what she's talking about. It's basically, all right, you want to make change and you want to have, have input to changing the way things are done, whether it's women, like around gender equality, whether it's about how we're treated. But instead of complaining about it, and I'm not saying that, we all complain about it because we're on the receiving end of racism and discrimination as black fellas as part of our daily experience. but to actually do something about it in some meaningful way. So getting a job in an organisation like the AFL and sitting in a position that you're in and being able to provide that perspective, like you said, sometimes it makes people uncomfortable or it's a bit disruptive, but you're there for a reason. And I would say for a lot of other Indigenous people, a lot of our mob, if we're not at the table, then things aren't going to change. So we need, if there are opportunities for us to participate in organisations, then, get in there and have a go. But for a lot of us, there's not that kind of pathway to go up the, if you want to call it the ladder. How do, when we have the skills, the qualifications and the experience to even be successful in a job, in an organisation, in any organisation, then there needs to be a career path for our mob to be able to then sit in positions like you're sitting in today at the AFL. So I would encourage a lot of organisations and people that are listening to this podcast to think about how you're growing and developing, your Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees. We make up 3% of the total population in this country, 3%. And 50% of our population, the Indigenous population, are under the age of 25. And 40% of those are under the age of 15. So you could basically say that half of the Indigenous population are children.
Yes.
We make up, when we think about school-age children, a third of the Indigenous population are enrolled in school. Now, the other 1.5% of the population that's over the age of 18, which is not a lot, that have the skills, the qualifications, again, not a lot. So I always say it's not about attracting the best talent, it's retaining them. Are you keeping them, and are you keeping them in the same job, or is there a pathway to develop your Indigenous employees? And I don't know, is there any advice that you could share with our listeners, especially for organisations on, growing talent and developing our mob?
Yeah, look, I agree with everything you're laying out there. For me, one of the things that I feel really strongly about is having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in decision-making roles.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of Indigenous employment programs in big companies, in government, really focus on either, graduates straight out of university into sort of low-level jobs, entry-level jobs, or, people who have just finished school, so traineeships and the like. Now, nothing wrong with starting there. I started at the bottom, and, perfectly happy about that. It's meant that I've learned a lot along the way. But one of the things that I would say is that I think there's got to be a greater emphasis on making sure that you've got Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on your boards and on your leadership teams, because it gives confidence to the Indigenous people in your workforce that your perspective is there's someone that is in a senior position who's able to speak to what your experience is.
Yeah.
And I was really surprised when I first started at the AFL, because I didn't appreciate that being on the executive was the big deal it is. I had all these women in football reach out to me to talk to me about what it was like to be a woman working in football. And so I just didn't have any idea. So all these women were reaching out to me to talk to me about what it was like for them as a woman in football. And these weren't women of colour. These weren't Indigenous women. These are just women who'd worked in footy for a long time and wanted me to know what it was like for them to be working in football. And obviously Indigenous staff working in clubs, working in football, were also telling me about their experiences. And then I discovered out of 18 football clubs, there was only one that had an Indigenous board member, and that was Samantha Riley at the Gold Coast Suns. So that was a shock, and I just knew that, you know, for better elements of cultural safety, cultural capability, but just the accountability for anything you're doing in the Indigenous space, then where was it going to come from if you didn't have someone who could call the leaders to account and ask the right questions of the CEO and the leadership team? I'm pleased to say that now there's 7 Indigenous board members across 18 clubs, so we're getting there, nearly halfway through. But, you know, I think about what happened with Collingwood this year, and the Do Better report that Professor Larissa Barrett did with Lyndon Coombs, looking into the history of racism at Collingwood Football Club. Now, I'm really certain that work probably could not have happened if it wasn't for the fact there was an Aboriginal woman at that board table, Jodie Sizer, helping lead them to a way that was going to help them deal with these issues head on. And I think great to open up employment opportunities in your businesses and your organisations for young Indigenous people, to get people into roles, get them into the workforce. But we've also got to remember that there's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are equipped, who have the right experience, have the governance credentials to be sitting on the boards of our banks, of our major institutions, and that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should not just be put into Indigenous advisory committees, that we've got bigger roles to play. There's just so much skill, experience, knowledge, wisdom in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that is not being accessed. We're not getting invited into those opportunities. And when I think about the really great work that's happened around increasing the number of women on Australian business boards, you know, what I'm hoping for is that very soon we'll start to see those positions and opportunities open up to Indigenous women and women of colour, because otherwise, before we know it, we might reach gender parity on boards, but they'll probably all be white women sitting opposite all white men.
What I want to say really quickly, Tanya, is you were you're well, an apology for Adam Goods from the AFL, and delivered a new industry framework to help prevent racist treatment of players. But you also championed the first Indigenous player statue of Nikki Winmar. So, you know, you've done a lot of things in the last 5 years, and probably things that people aren't aware of. And I want to share that with people that are listening to this podcast. So I just want to say thank you. Huge congratulations, but more of a thank you for doing what you do and for supporting all of us in this country when it comes to creating positive change, especially when it comes to AFL. But that, like I said, that just stems out to broader society as well. It's, you know, everyday Australians learning from us and hopefully doing things better because of us, that they've got people like you sitting in that table to hold them to account, to ask those kind of hard questions. And if it makes people feel uncomfortable, well, so be it. But yeah, I just want to say thank you for everything that you've been doing and for the role that you're playing at AFL. And hopefully with what you're doing, it's inspiring more Indigenous people and women in particular. I'm a big supporter of our women getting involved and participating in the workforce, and also juggling all of those family and cultural responsibilities and obligations that women do. But yeah, if there's any last words that you want to share with people before we say goodbye, I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, look, thanks. It's just been a real privilege to be invited onto the show. Really enjoy speaking with you, and I am thrilled about the work that I know that you're doing and the impact it's happening in places all around Australia, with the conversations that you're helping people to have that they need to be having. It's great to have another woman's voice, a strong woman's voice out there. And I think that this podcast is a great asset for everyone. And, yeah, thanks for the privilege of having me on your program, and, you know, for the support and, you know, and for valuing, you know, the contributions that I make. So thank you.
And I've got to say really quickly, when you started talking about my dad, I had to sit here for a moment and just hold back the tears. But I really wish that I sat in that meeting to hear his perspective, because I was, you know, I would say I've been heavily influenced by my dad in the work that I do and the family that I've grown up in. You know, definitely a politically active family. But in the role that I'm in at the Black Card and working with my elders and trying to create positive change in this country, there are so many things that I wish I could ask my dad. What would you do, Dad? Or how can I do this? Or should I have done this differently? But you know what? I'm lucky that I've got someone like my Aunt Lilla that supports me in everything that I do. So I just started to think about, I wish I sat in that meeting to listen to his views about things, especially when it comes to, you know, like the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which we haven't had time to talk about. But I'm hoping, Tanya, that I can reach out to you with my Black Card hat and maybe get you to do a guest presentation and a Black Card workshop to start talking about things that you're doing. So, look, this is not going to be the last time that we yarn. I'm going to reach out to you after today and see how we can work together in 2022. So thank you so much for, like I said, taking out an hour out of your busy schedule to join me today. I really appreciate your time, and I'm really excited to see what lies ahead for what you're going to do in the coming years in the role that you're in at AFL. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks so much.
What an absolute inspiration to hear from a deadly First Nations woman like Tanya, who's doing amazing things. We didn't talk about this, but Tanya also helped found advocacy organisation, the Indigenous Players Alliance. She drove a new respect and responsibility policy, enabling women to seek redress for unacceptable behaviour, and a world-first gender diversity policy for a contact sport. You know, one of the preeminent Indigenous leaders pursuing constitutional recognition of Australia's First Nations people, Tanya's principled leadership is transforming the AFL, advancing women, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, gender diverse Australians and the entire community. She is the first Indigenous person, as she said, and the second woman appointed to the AFL executive, and has held leadership roles in sports, the arts, culture, social justice and public policy. And she was the South Australian 2021 Australian of the Year. So, you know, there was a lot there that hopefully you found, you know, valuable, and I'm pretty sure that you were inspired just as much as I was hearing her story and what she's been able to achieve at the AFL. And, you know, there is still a lot of progress to be made, but if you're not sitting at the table, you know, with that Indigenous voice and that Indigenous perspective, then how can we create the change that's needed in this country, but in organisations like the AFL? So I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Until next time, bye for now.
Don't forget to follow Black Magic Woman Podcast on all social media platforms. To keep up to date with the latest episodes and news, head to blackmagicwoman.com.au. You can rate and review the podcast on iTunes, and please feel free to share the podcast with your family and friends.